Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. Conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now, podcasting from the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center in Chicagoland, here are your hosts, Ed Stetzer and Daniel Yang.
Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name is Daniel Yang, the director of the Church Multiplication Institute, and we're excited to have with us today Dr. Jemar Tisby. Jemar is a New York Times best-selling author, national speaker, and public historian on a mission to deliver truths from the Black experience with depth and clarity. He's the author of several books, including The Color of Compromise, and most recently, How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity, and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. We want to remind you that if you're enjoying our interviews, we'd love it if you would leave us a review. You can also check out the extended portions of some of our interviews at ChurchLeaders.com+. Now, before we hear from Jemar, let's go to Ed Stetzer, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the executive director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center.
So let's jump into the conversation. Jemar, for those listening, Jemar and I have known each other for years, and so we're going to have a conversation that I think presses in on some issues, but they're a conversation between people who care about one another and because Jemar has become a figure in the news. So here you were, you're minding your own business. You've spoken here at Wheaton College, and your message here at the Wheaton College Chapel did rile some people up. I got texts from people because you mentioned Billy Graham, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. You mentioned Billy Graham in the message. I then listened to the message, but you made the national news because of Grove City College, and again, to be clear, a sister institution to Wheaton College, right? So tell us a little bit about what happened, and then we're going to talk through it a bit.
Thanks, Ed. Just want to reiterate the graciousness that you've shown me. I'm glad to be on the show here today. The occasion was October 2020. Mind you, this is weeks before the presidential election in November. I get invited to Grove City College, and I spoke there. I gave a chapel presentation. I had lunch with I had a meeting with some students of color. I also had a meeting with the now defunct President's Committee on Diversity, Advisory Committee, and I gave an evening presentation there, a book talk on The Color of Compromise. I had a bit of trepidation going in because I knew it was a conservative school. And a lot of times that means, they're not going to vibe with everything I say on race, but I didn't have any context for Grove City. So I went in there, spoke as forthrightly, but graciously as I could, and thought nothing more of it after the trip. It was over a year later, in November 2021, a petition came out called Save GCC from CRT, Save Grove City College from Critical Race Theory. It was from, quote, a group of concerned parents and former students. Why they didn't say alumni, I don't know. But that's what it was. And they were talking about supposed mission drift at the school. One of the examples they used was the supposed infiltration of wokeism and critical race theory and secular ideas about this stuff. And they cited me and my chapel presentation in particular as an example of that mission drift, as something that shouldn't have happened. In response, the president of the school, President McNulty, wrote a letter. Events continued, and they formed a subcommittee from the Board of Trustees to investigate this mission drift, which focused on critical race theory, what they called critical race theory. And subsequently, that report was released in April. And then about a month later, the Board of Trustees as a whole officially decided to accept and adopt the report. In that report, they spent an entire page on me, particularly my chapel message. They said, Jemar isn't who we thought he was. And they said, quote, it was a mistake to invite me to speak at chapel. Now, Ed, real quick, I just want to say there's always opposition. There's always disagreement when I speak at Christian colleges and universities. You mentioned even at Wheaton, there was some conversation. Never has it risen to this level of an institutional response.
Okay.
So this is now the official position of the Board of Trustees that it was a mistake to invite me. They also threw under the bus, in my opinion, several of their faculty and staff who were engaged in these kinds of efforts. So because it was an official institutional response, that's why I decided to speak out publicly about it.
Okay, so they indicated that you were not who they expected. Quote, you're an outspoken apologist for CRT, unquote. And I do want to talk about this some, because you're not who you used to be. When we first started interacting with one another, you were a student at RTS. You were doing the Reformed African American Network. Our mutual friend John Richards, served on the board. I had the privilege of serving with him here for a while. He's now pastoring in Little Rock. But you have certainly moved on some issues. And what the question is what is that movement? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I imagine that from your perspective, it's a good thing. What are some things that are different in the way Jemar sees the world, or sees evangelicalism, or sees race? Just unpack some of those things. Leave loud is something that you helped to put before in the whole conversation. What's different? Because they said you weren't who they thought you were. What is different?
So first off, by the time they invited me and I spoke at Grove City College, all of these shifts had happened.
Right.
So, and none of it was in secret. So
yeah.
It
sure.
wasn't
At
like
Wheaton College, it all happened by the time you were at Wheaton College. So we knew who you were when we had you at Wheaton College.
And, when you invite a speaker, you should know what you're getting. You should do your homework in that sense. So I want to make that clear that Grove City's, the board's assessment of me about shifting and changing, that was all in the past by this point. So what you're talking about, I was waving the banner for Reformed white evangelicalism in the early 2010s. In 2011, I started the African American leadership at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, which has its own pedigree. I started what was then the Reformed African American Network. At that point, I really and truly believed that we could, as Black Christians, have a place at the table, by which I mean the Reformed and white evangelical institutional table, whether that was a seminary or a website or what have you, churches, denominations, things of that nature. What I came to understand through a series of events, from the murder of Trayvon Martin to the rise of Black Lives Matter to the election of Donald Trump, was the table was never built with Black people in mind, really. Even if there wasn't overt animosity, it really just wasn't built with us in mind. And therefore, it was much harder, if not impossible, to truly have a place at the table on an equal standing with everyone else. So we went from trying to sort of elbow our way in and try to find space at this table for many people who are reluctant to make that space, to building our own tables. Mm-hmm. So that's when we changed our name to The Witness, a Black Christian collective. That's when I withdrew from the ordination process in the Presbyterian Church in America. That's when I made a conscious decision to spend less time doing what I call racial apologetics and making the case that we should be talking about racism, to actually serving the people who are marginalized and most adversely impacted by racism. That had all taken place by 2017.
Right.
So if there was a shift, I think it was certainly prior. And I don't think, like I said, it was very public. I mean, no secret here. So, but giving the benefit of the doubt that maybe they weren't aware of that, it is important even in our conversation. So you have shifted and to some places, like, for example, I hope you're wrong about place at the table. I'm working to make a different reality. So we're not going to agree on some of the things that are here, which, by the way, is part of what we do in education, is we hear from people who we disagree with, we don't always agree with. Okay, so just for framing for people who don't know you, so last time we talked, we were talking about your PhD and how you need to finish it. So first of all, let me just say, I'm so glad we had some strong language in that conversation. Yes,
so I'm glad.
For your encouragement.
I'm glad you finished it. Okay, so as a Christian, how would you? Last time we talked about, you used the word evangelical adjacent. Mm-hmm. So what do you believe? Because you've gone through seminary, you have a master's in divinity. There are words that would articulate where is Jemar as a follower of Jesus today. So if we want to listen to him, we understand from his perspective as a Christ follower. What does that look like for you?
That's good. First, for our listeners, let's understand, a lot of times with folks who talk about justice issues, particularly around race, there are these tests and checks we send people through to say, well, do they check all the same theological boxes that I do therefore I should listen to them. Or if they don't, I can dismiss them. Right. So I just think we should make that conscious and clear.
And you often reject that approach.
Oftentimes do. Because, I mean, the body of Christ is large. The tree has many branches, and we don't have to agree on every jot and tittle of theology for us to find valuable things in other people say. That's how I can learn from white theologians. That's how I can learn from even pro-slavery or pro-segregation theologian, right? So understand that there are groups of Christians who do this all the time. It's a lot of times people in the majority who don't understand or make conscious that dynamic. So I just want to say that as a preamble.
I receive it.
Great. So, and you actually model that, I think, really well. So I think I have learned much, much more about the Black church tradition and historic Black Christianity, and I take a lot of my cues from it. This was not an education that I really received in majority white Christian spaces, whether churches or seminaries or books or anything else. So it's a learning that I had to undertake on my own. And, this is very basic, but again, checking our bookshelves and checking even the books that we reference for our sermons, for our teaching, for our Sunday school classes, for our new members classes, that needs to expand because, again, the body of Christ is large and we can learn from a lot of different people. Speaking of history, when you talk about something like the Black church, it doesn't exist necessarily because of deep theological disagreements with white Christians. So if you go back to the period immediately following the Civil War, this is when Black people are finally free in many different senses of the word. And one of the first things Black Christians do is form their own churches, their own fellowships, and their own denominations. Why? Not because they were disputing the divinity of Christ, not because they were talking about the Trinity or any sort of kind of core theological issue. It's because they didn't want to be treated as second-class citizens in the household of God. And I think a similar pattern is at play today. I'm not the only one who feels distanced, in some senses pushed out of white evangelicalism. There are a lot of people across the color line who do that and who feel that way. And oftentimes the difference is not some deep theological issue that you would read about in a systematic theology textbook. It's because we have felt some sort of exclusion or marginalization for reasons that shouldn't be so in the body of Christ.
So are you saying then you share a lot of the same theological beliefs you had before? Am I misstating this? However, it's been pushed out and now you're understanding more deeply the Black theological tradition and maybe some of the fact that may embrace some of those issues differently. I'm trying to help myself understand what you're answering.
Yeah. So think about it this way. A lot of times in predominantly white Christian settings, the starting point for theology, for sermons, for teaching is the resurrection. And that makes sense. The starting point is a lot of times Paul's epistles, right? In the very sort of logical, propositional way Paul explains his theology. Understandable, it's all Bible, we learn from it all. In the Black church tradition, oftentimes the starting point is the Exodus, the literal liberation of enslaved people. Oftentimes the starting point is the Old Testament and the prophets who speak against injustice, who call out the powers that be for mistreating and misabusing or abusing their power, right? So it's all the same Bible, it's all the same faith, but because of our lived experiences and locations, we have sort of really foundational pillars that shape our public engagement with justice issues. So I'm trying to be in the line of a Martin Luther King Jr., of a Fannie Lou Hamer, of a Medgar Evers, all very strong Christians who saw integrally the connection between Jesus and justice. What I have faced in predominantly white settings is a highly individualistic understanding of the world, and particularly racism, that doesn't really give due attention, in my view, to the issues of policies and systems and power when it comes to racism.
So, because individualization is a key aspect of evangelicalism. It's God, humans, Christ's response. It's a personal decision. It's, we deal with our own sin and maybe confront someone else on their sin, but to see the systems and structures And yet it's simultaneously, when Tom Skinner got up at Urbana in 1970, he also spoke as a follower of Christ who appealed to the scriptures, who ticked off a lot of people at that meeting, and yet simultaneously spoke from that community in some way, even though it wasn't always received in that community.
That's right.
And I would say 10 years ago, you spoke from that community.
Yeah.
And today, I think you speak sometimes to that community. And I think both of those are valuable. So how should I, as your friend, as a white evangelical, how should I hear Jemar Tisby's critique today?
You used the phrase earlier, evangelical adjacent. I've recently started using that phrase, but I think it's always been true because there's always been a somewhat separation because of race. So even when I was more speaking out of the sort of white evangelical context, there was always a sense of being in but not of,
Fair.
And not in a sin and holiness kind of way, more of a cultural, racial kind of way. Mm-hmm. So I think there's always been that dynamic of both speaking out of and to white evangelicals. So for folks who are listening, how you should hear me is as one who has been deeply, deeply, deeply in these circles. Like I said, I was in the ordination process of a very conservative evangelical and Reformed denomination.
We can say Presbyterian Church America takes one Google. So you're going through the PCA ordination process.
Yeah, I went to Reformed Theological Seminary, and they have multiple campuses. I went to the flagship campus in Jackson, Mississippi.
In Jackson, don't miss the historical connection there. Jackson, Mississippi.
Exactly right. I started the Reformed African American Network, so I came to faith in a white evangelical youth group and church context. So hear me as one whose church home has really been historically white evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. So I speak from a place of love and appreciation. Mm-hmm. And I speak because I want it to be better. And I want it to be better precisely because I have had this intimate personal experience within it. So I'm not one who doesn't understand evangelicalism, who looks at all the caricatures and just throws stones. I'm one who's been in it, who's been a leader in it, who's been vocal in public in it, and who's been burned by institutions and certain individuals. And I don't want that to happen to more people. Yeah. That's where I'm coming from.
And I read, and let me make sure so someone could put this on some edited podcast somewhere. I read and encourage you to read Jemar's books, particularly The Color of Compromise, The Truth About American Churches, Complicity and Racism, and more recently, How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity, and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. Okay, so that's you. But now you're a critical race theorist. I read it on the internet. They can't put it on the internet unless it's true. So talk to me about critical race theory because it has become a major issue. Using the phrase Black Lives Matter was a major issue 4 or 5 years ago. Now I think critical race theory is it. And are you a critical race theorist? If so, why or why not?
I am a historian.
Yeah.
And critical race theory is something that is prevalent most often in legal studies. So no, I'm not a critical race theorist, but I'm quick to point out, I don't think that should be a pejorative in the first place. Mm-hmm. So even as we deny, or as I say, I'm not a critical race theorist, it's not because I think there's something demonic inherently about the theory or the people who study it. Right. I say I'm not a critical race theorist out of respect for actual scholars who do this work.
Who are there? But the cultural expression people. So I think for a little people here say I'm not a critical race theorist, or critical race theory is not taught in schools, right. which I would say that. But that has become, I think, for good or for ill, and maybe more for ill than for good, that has become a catch-all term for when you express, for example, that the system itself is inherently racist throughout, that it pits, people would say, groups against one another without any path to redemption or reconciliation. So let's agree that you and I, not everyone will agree, that critical race theory as an academic discipline, I'm not an expert in the field. You probably know more about it than I do, but you wouldn't put yourself in that category because you're not a legal theorist. But some of the ideas do point to just how much racism is a part of our everyday existence,
Right.
or not. So when we look at it more broadly, where does that fit with your thinking? Because I want to be among one of those who say, I believe racism is real. I think there are parts of racism that have projected into the present, and there are parts of our society that still are systemically racist. I'm not one who would say that and we may disagree on this, that the totality of the system is, one provost at a conservative seminary said, paraphrasing, if you peel back, you'll see it's just all built on the construct of racism. So where might I fit in there, and what might you say to me if I might say, I believe in systemic racism, but I also think some people take it too far, and that's often under the cultural expression of critical race theory.
Yeah. Okay, great. So as a historian, I'm interested in origins.
Right.
So critical race theory arose in the 1970s-ish, and there was a particular sort of founding intellectual who helped formulate it named Derek Bell. And he's asking basic questions like, if after all of this activity in the civil rights movement, after all of this momentum, all of this conversation, all of these supposed changes, why are Black people still marginalized, still not reaping the benefits of being in this nation, still not being able to tap into the American dream? And basically he was saying, well, you can still have very racially unequal laws and policies without expressly using racial terms like Black or white. And he started to analyze the way laws and policies, the most famous example, of course, being the difference in sentencing for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine.
Right.
Both cocaine, both drugs, both illegal and illicit, but crack cocaine, which is more prevalent in poorer and Black communities, had a much, much harsher sentencing than powder cocaine. That law has since been revised because of the attention drawn to those kinds of disparities. So that's what critical race theory in its origins is trying to explain. So what about today in the 21st century, 40, 50 years hence? In 2020, we experienced, by the numbers, the largest social movement in U.S. history.
Right.
Literally millions of people, many of them white, marching in protest against racism, in particular anti-Black police brutality.
Yeah, larger than the civil rights movement in the 60s, important to note.
Yes, exactly. So I really see this, what I call an anti-CRT crusade, partially as backlash against that.
Yes.
What started happening in 2020, people read books like White Fragility and Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, which, by the way, people still think I work at the Center for Anti-Racism.
That's on my list of questions. That's on my list of questions.
We'll get there.
We're going to get to that.
I don't work there.
We're going to get that. But people do put you in that frame. And by the way, your book, Color of Compromise, actually went to the New York Times bestseller list after it was out. It sold out on all printing locations after the murder of George Floyd and the response to that. And you became New York Times bestseller. So people were having these conversations all over. So I agree that the CRT panic, as I call it, is a response to some of that. And simultaneously, I want to press a little bit on what it actually means. But keep going to what you were saying. So
we have to look at it in that context. And I think people got really spooked and up in arms when in Christian circles, they started talking about things like white privilege and about, institutional or systemic racism. And it seemed like for certain people that this was pervasive. This kind of talk about race and racism was pervasive. It was very new to them. And they felt, if they were white, like they were just sinful because of their white, because they were white. So it was, I think, partly in response to this wave of attention, renewed attention that racism got. And it really put people who were comfortable with the status quo on their heels, and they found ways to push back.
Well, you said things that were discombobulating to some people. You, for example, pointed out, because the story we tell about, I stand in a corner. I don't think you've never been to the museum here, but I stand in a corner. At least when you spoke in chapel, I was out of town. And there's this picture of Billy Graham next to Martin Luther King Jr. And I explain Billy Graham's complex thoughts and his, for example, we all know he took down the ropes at Chattanooga. We also know he preached to segregated crusades before that. We know that you pointed all this out in the book. Didn't go to Selma. He actually, the disagreement on the March on Washington. And Billy Graham would say, this was, I'm not sure if it's the greatest or one of the greatest regrets of his life, was not being involved in the civil rights movement. And that was one of our recent conversations you and I had, is one of the reasons I want to be concerned about these issues. But when you point that out, it's interesting to me, things that Billy Graham said later were true, you point them out, and we don't maybe tell them in the hagiography. The Billy Graham's actually pretty clear that we should have been engaged and involved. So by pointing out those realities, it seems to undermine, I think, some of people's, and it makes people uncomfortable. And you don't seem to be worried about making people uncomfortable because they need to be made uncomfortable. So why is that?
I don't ever intend to make people unnecessarily uncomfortable.
Oh, that unnecessarily word is doing a lot of work in this sentence.
It's got to, because the caricature on the internet is that I'm just sort of gleefully typing at my keyboard, ooh, what's really going to make white evangelicals mad? I should say this. No, it's not that. It grieves me that we don't have a better historical record when it comes to the U.S. church and race. I'm talking about predominantly white Christian circles. But there is a kind of conflict that is necessary when truth-telling and peacemaking. So when we think about MLK's quote about, the absence of conflict versus the presence of peace, right? That's really what we're getting to. And I think that's what shifted in white evangelicalism in the 2010s. I would trace the modern evangelical racial reconciliation movement back to the late 80s, early 90s. I would say that had momentum and steam up through the early 2010s. And I think in that period, we thought an absence of conflict over racial issues, particularly in the church, was the presence of peace. But then when certain circumstances, like the murder of Trayvon Martin and many, many other incidents, pressed the issue, and we started from Black people speaking the truth in our realities that are still present today around racism, that caused a conflict which disrupted this superficial kind of peace, in quotation marks. And so I think that's really the shift. Mm-hmm. All of that is within the context of, just as there are people who go overboard on the racial status quo, exaggerate, say things clumsily, maybe even have really harmful ideas, the same is true for people who want to change the racial status quo.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, you can absolutely find instances of people overstating things, people really, really being unloving toward white people in their zeal to see, racism reduced. I try to avoid that. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Okay. So, but you did go to work for Ibram Kendi. So let's talk some about that. And yes. And now you're not. And so give a little bit of biography here of what's going on. What's the thinking through this journey?
So in March 2021, I stepped down from my role as founder and CEO of The Witness. And
you can't step down your role from founder.
Right, exactly. I was thinking that as I spoke it. And I did that in order to take a job at the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University. A couple of things were happening. One, I was rounding out my dissertation, and so I was going to be graduating soon. And the typical thing is, if you get your PhD, particularly as a historian, you go to work at a college or university. Yeah. Those jobs are in short supply, as you well know. And so this was an opportunity as a scholar to work.
I just want to push back on that in a loving way, because you and I have talked that there are multiple schools that are literally holding chairs for you that you have declined. Let's just be honest about this. I won't name them, but you and I have talked about them. And they're in the South. I mean, brother. So,
that what I'm talking about and the way I try to talk about it, I would be constantly in battle mode in a lot of.
Well, I think that's probably fair. Yeah. Okay. So keep going back. I interrupted your story, but I didn't want it to sound like you're just sitting around saying, I don't got anywhere to work, so I think I'm going to go work for Kendi.
If maybe we had taken some of these lessons to heart earlier, I would have plenty of options.
Okay.
So it was an academic job. It was an R1 research university.
Yeah.
So, it's a great position for an academic. In addition, they had incredible resources and incredible reach. So for me, it was an opportunity to continue the work that I was doing on a larger scale. So I worked at that job remotely for 5 months. I say remote because I still live in the Mississippi Delta on the Arkansas side. And but for several reasons decided it just wasn't the right fit. So I stepped down from that August 5th, 2021. I remember the date because it's the same date I defended my dissertation.
Nice.
So I haven't worked there. So this is part of my frustration with this Grove City College report, and many people who criticize me online. There's a laziness there to not even know that I haven't worked at this place for 8-9 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of it. And the reason why that's important is because people use that association to dismiss me, because obviously I'm in the enemy camp, so I can't be trusted.
No, there's no question. I mean, I will get all kinds of stuff just lit up on the internet because of even this conversation. Even when I'm pressing you on stuff, it'll just light up internet. Okay, so what do you do now other than make the national news for sermons you did a few years ago?
It's been interesting. I'm a historian, author, speaker. Most of my time is spent writing at my newsletter. The invitations to speak at Christian colleges haven't been as voluminous as before. I don't know if that's directly connected to anything or not. And then I'm still hoping to write books, trying to work on the next book contract now. But that's it. I mean, I'm self-employed at this point. And you mentioned before, I just want to make clear, when I speak to faculty and particularly staff of color at predominantly white Christian colleges and universities, even nonprofits in general, there is a weariness there.
Yeah.
There is a stressed outness there because, I mean, honestly, for the last 10 years, it's been wave after wave after wave of current events that press the issue that we need to change the racial status quo. We need to make progress in our institutions. That progress has been very slow, if non-existent in some places. And there are people who are working within these institutions that are just tired. Mm-hmm. They are worn out. They stay because of the students.
Yeah.
They stay because of faith and hope. But how many times can your efforts be railroaded or disempowered or impeded or spoken against before you're like, I can't do this anymore.
Right.
So I've been in that position. I haven't taken certain positions because I don't want to be there. And it literally affects your mental and your physical health over time. And I'm just seeing that more and more. And I just want to say that because there might be folks listening who don't realize that's a reality for some folks, and maybe within their own organizations. But that's why, we have to be very circumspect as people who talk about racial justice, about where we go and where we align ourselves.
Yeah, one sentence will be taken, even if, let's say it's not taken out of context, it was a sentence uttered at the wrong time in the wrong way. That sentence will be the thing that people seek to paint you and define you with forever. So or in this case, the employment. I think the Christian college thing, the employment with the partnership with Kindy, I think is probably part of why that is. And I think it's important to kind of see that as part of your journey. I want to understand how then we should think about some of these issues of race. So the example you gave was super helpful. The example of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. I planted a church in the inner city of Buffalo, New York, during the crack epidemic of the late 80s and 90s. And I wrote about this later in the Washington Post. We'll put it in the show notes. And because my example was the way I perceived the crack epidemic in the 80s versus the meth addiction in rural communities today. And I wrote, I think they put the headline in My Double Standard on these issues. And that's an example where critical race theory, the understanding of how we deal with law, impacts those things. And I think most people, when look at this, would say, that's an example of the system itself impacting through law disproportionately African American communities. So again, if we say that to be the case, So here's where Ed Stetzer is. Might be the wrong place. I want you to help me. So I learned about systemic racism probably in my early 20s, pastoring in a predominantly African, that neighborhood we saw with that Tops Market, that was a mile from my home. And so predominantly African-American community. I think the neighborhood I lived in was 40% African-American, 30% Anglo, and then everybody else. So I believed in systemic racism, that there are things in the past that project into the present, including we gave the example of how legal and sentencing systems work. So I believed in systemic racism, believe in systemic racism. After the murder of George Floyd, these conversations subtly accelerated. We'll put an article in the show notes from Ross Douthat at the New York Times called Waking Up in 2030. And he uses the example of how people see race, where some people said, the whole system's just inherently racist. And again, we talked about this earlier, you peel it back and everything is built on systemic racism. And things where the 1619 Project come out and really point to the prevalence. Your book talks about the evangelical complicity. Again, I want to encourage people to pick it up. The evangelical complicity. And these are not like, when you talk about your book, these are like quotes. These are not like things that they're opinions. You're an historian. So my question is, for me as a Christian who happens to be white, who's an evangelical, who believes systemic racism is real, but I don't see everything as being built on, the entire system, the substructure being built on a rotting corpse of racism. Again, I'm quoting a conservative provost or paraphrasing a conservative provost at a seminary. Where do I fit? And am I wrong? Should I think differently? Because I think a lot of our listeners would say, I think after George Floyd's murder, people said, I think police maybe treated him differently because he was African American. So I can say that to be real and true, but I'm concerned about everything being labeled that way. Are we wrong? Help me. And I won't hurt my feelings.
I appreciate that. I'll say this. As a historian, the more you study the past, the more racism you find, not less. Okay. So for instance, we were talking earlier about Billy Graham pulling down the ropes, and this is a year before Brown v. Board, right? So he's ahead of the curve on the Supreme Court decision on desegregation. But you also find a very strong anti-communism theme in Graham's teachings, a teaching that was weaponized and often code against civil rights activists. And there's a lot of theory and concept that goes into, collectivism and Marxism and things like that. But understand that a lot of evangelical opposition to communism also had the impact of opposing civil rights activists and the movement in general. So that's another layer that as you study history, you're like, there's racial implications there that I never thought about. There are so many instances, for instance, as we talk about George Floyd and anti-Black, why are Black people so activated when we see another video of these instances? It's not just that one incident. It's because we're aware of the historical pattern such that even the Black Panthers, which were much reviled in their day, were originally called the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Self-defense against whom or what? Against police brutality, police coming in their communities and brutalizing local Black people. So all I'm saying is, as you study the pattern of human behavior in this nation, you find more instances of racial prejudice and inequality and not less. And I just think that white evangelicals who already, by the statistics and the polling, see racism as less of an issue than other people.
Than any other group in polling.
Any other group of people, which is telling. I think that the burden and the somewhat of a mission needs to be to highlight how racism is, in fact, still a problem and has been for a long time.
Okay, I agree that racism still is a problem. I believe that has been for a long time. I agree that we can read history, and the more we read history, the more we see that reality. I'm also so let's say I want to be aware of those things, which I think you and I know each other long enough to know that I would say I'm one who's sought to be more aware. I've learned more. I've learned from you. I've learned from others. I've also learned that there are things that a whole lot of people are saying that I don't see as true. For example, I do believe that as a white person that I am treated and received differently. My friend Charlie Dates and I went around and he wanted to meet for dinner before I knew him well, and we went out and just engage people in the community differently. I mean, he's just treated very differently. We're walking around together, and you know that downtown Chicago very differently. Charlie, for those of you who don't know, is African American. So all of those things that you've said are true. Yet I also read some authors, because I read widely in and around this space, who I'm saying, you know what, I think they're just taking it too far. And there seems to be like a sense that if I don't agree with those distances that they're going, that I'm not going, am I missing it? Am I a white moderate in this case? Because again, let me be clear, I do have concerns about the cultural expression of what some might call critical race theory, though I see most of it as CRT panic, where it's just like, if your pastor mentions systemic racism, which I think is real and identifiable in our culture today, that pastor gets letters saying CRT has taken over the church. So, but for some of us, we kind of feel in this space like, I'm not going as far as they're going, and I want to be aware. So help me to understand, how should I respond when am I a white moderate for not believing everything is undergirded by a rotting corpse of racism?
I'll just speak for myself.
Yeah.
I want people to see that oftentimes the most problematic and clear issues of racism are differences in degree, not in kind.
Okay.
So I want people to understand that compromise in one area or instance is actually a turned down volume of something more overt. So when I was in seminary, it was in this part of Jackson that was considered, quote unquote, the bad part of town. And I would hear other seminarians, other Christians saying, don't go to that neighborhood, or don't go to, that part of town. Of course, these are majority Black parts of the city. I mean, Jackson is majority Black overall, but that sort of assumption, and you ministered in this, you lived in a community that maybe people would say, don't go to that part of town.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
The mayor said that to me. The mayor of Buffalo said that to me. But yeah.
So peel back the layer. What does that statement indicate about what that person believes about Black people, about other people of color, right? So even in the color of compromise, what I was trying to say is the most egregious acts of racism occur within a context of complicity. And a white lawyer, Charles Morgan Jr., stood up and told other white people after the Birmingham church bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church, who threw that bomb, he said, we all did it. Why? Because bombings like that had happened before, and there wasn't enough community outrage, particularly among white Christians, to say no more and never again. And so now, even in our political environment, we have people, elected politicians, literally touting the great replacement theory, right? This is connected to the Buffalo massacre, that there's some insidious plot by Jewish people and Democrats to replace good old-fashioned white folks and populate the nation with people of color so that the politics will be different. That notion, which is racist to its core, is being touted at the highest levels. And so the point I want people to get is, if you are silent when politicians or pundits are touting that, and then a literal, violent, deadly massacre occurs, we can't just wipe our hands of that. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. It does. It does. And so, okay, I don't want to wipe my hands of it. I want to, pastors and church leaders listen to this podcast. I want them to listen and learn, as I have learned from you and from others. Not means we don't have to agree on every single thing, but we need to know. And history is certainly, you're an historian. It's worth noting that Jemar's an historian, but also an advocate. Matter of fact, let me mention your books again so people can pick them up as well. One is, of course, The Color of Compromise, but How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity in the Journey Towards Racial Justice. What was the award it just won? I should have had that in my notes. What was the award it just won?
It won in the faith and culture category for the Christian Book Awards.
Love that. Love that. And want to encourage people to read it, find it helpful. You'll be challenged by it for sure. Okay, so I guess here I am agreeing with you about systemic racism, agreeing about history that's here, working towards that. I think you would say that I've been an advocate and an ally. But I guess the question is what do you want from me, like someone like me, that is not now where I think a whole lot of pastors would be in that space. I want to talk about those who are afraid to speak up on it in just a minute. But maybe they internally feel that way. What am I missing from your view? Because I can tell you, Kindy thinks I'm missing a whole lot, and Right Fragility thinks I'm missing a whole lot, and I could give a whole lot of other things that thinks I'm missing a whole lot. Do you think what do you say, Ed, you should also think, no, engage this?
I love this conversation.
No, I know. Listen, we don't play around. We don't play around.
Well, you're one of the few who really asks me what I think and what I hope. What I hope is that white evangelicals will see more of the institutional and systemic manifestations of racism, and not just the individual and the interpersonal manifestations of racism. Right. That is to say that racism has a personal dimension, does talk about how an individual expresses racial bias toward another individual. But that's not all. That racism expresses itself in the way we do life in this country. And so what I'm hoping is that if we acknowledge the history, so what's interesting about the color of compromise, people of all ideological persuasions are in agreement with the history. Because like you said, I use primary sources. I'm talking about quotes. I'm not just giving my opinion, right? But then the resistance comes in two places. The resistance comes when I start talking about the rise of the religious right.
Yeah, sure.
And this political marriage between some parts of white evangelicalism and the Republican Party. And the other part of resistance comes in, what do we do about this historic racism that continues to exert momentum in the present? Those are the areas where there's disagreement. What I want folks to understand is we do have to change policies. And I'm not even just talking on a federal level. I'm talking about our Christian schools and universities and nonprofits, right? I'm talking about let's make sure that if we are appropriately outraged about racism in the past, that we don't repeat the gradualism, the complacency of the past, and that we take decisive action in the present.
Last question, I think. Pastors and church leaders have seen. I actually do a seminar on the post-COVID world, and part of it I talk about you in that. I talk about the color of compromise, and I talk about in summer 2020. I mean, everyone was having a conversation. Well, I shouldn't say everyone, but I mean, I usually when I'm at a meeting, where was I? I was with Vineyard leaders last week, and time this recording. And if I asked how many of you had a conversation during the summer of 2020 about race or racial injustice or systemic racism, almost everyone says yes. And I said, how many of you heard about that critically from people who were upset with you within just a few, if not immediately within a few months? And almost everyone says yes. So there was a time, again, all the books sold off the shelves. Yours, John Perkins, all John Perkins' books sold out. I think, I'm trying to remember who else told me, several other people Christians who wrote in that space, all their books sold out. And it seems that we're at a very different place than where we were in summer 2020. And right now, a lot of our listeners, pastors and church leaders, are saying, if I mention Jemar Tisby, if I mention Jemar Tisby, so here I am mentioning Jemar Tisby. So I'm with you. I'm walking this journey with you. That I'll lose people in my church. There'll be a cost to this. Now, there's a letter that circulated around the internet, a very famous pastor that almost everyone on this call would know, who since with the Lord and has a different view, but when he was a pastor of a church in California, wrote Wheaton College after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and our students here held a vigil. And in that letter, he was pretty strong. He said, said, it seems incredible that a Christian college could participate in honoring an outright theological liberal heretic whose nonviolent demonstrations have resulted in the deaths of 17 people. He's talking about, of course, Martin Luther King. As a pastor, I'm asked every year by parents and prospective students to express my sentiments of Wheaton College. In all fairness, I'd like to know if this article adequately describes the fact. I honestly would be quite delighted if you can say no. So Wheaton College, 1968, this is a letter that's sent May 23rd, 1968. And we can just go back and see April 4, 1968, when King was assassinated. There's a cost. I also want to pastor my congregation and walk through that. So I want you, in our closing answer, to speak to, not all of our listeners aren't white, but to speak to white evangelical pastors who are unsure how to lead through this, to be faithful to scriptures, to love their congregations as they are. And what would you exhort them to do, say, and lead?
Tell the truth.
Okay.
Speak the truth in love. The Bible said that the word is sharper than any two-edged sword. It says that the truth will divide. And I think that's what's happening right now, such that when you mention either certain individuals or certain ideas around racism, racial justice, there's a division. Mm-hmm. But perhaps there's a necessary division. Perhaps there's a pruning. Perhaps there is a sifting that needs to happen in church environments, denominational environments that have for so long taken the absence of conflict on racism as the presence of peace. And now what I would encourage pastors to do is walk in a manner worthy of your calling, the foundation of which is to speak the truth in love. Why? In that passage, so that the body may grow. And what I need folks to understand is to go back and meditate on Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus said, "Blessed are you if you are persecuted for righteousness' sake." So if speaking the truth about racism is indeed righteous, which I believe it is, then blessed are you when you are persecuted for speaking that truth. And in the very next verse, it identifies a certain kind of persecution as people saying all kinds of lies about you. So understand that email, that label, that, when they call you a critical race theorist, when they call you a liberal or a heretic or whatever, that's some of what Jesus was talking about. And it tells us that in the very next verse. So all I can say is the way is narrow, which for pastors will mean oftentimes you will lose money and you will lose people. And we haven't talked about my local church situation, but that's a saga in and of itself, because we endured a church split because of what I think was white Christian nationalism. And all I'm saying is many pastors either completely avoid or take a very, very moderate approach to these issues because fundamentally they don't want to lose money or people. Now, I don't think it's this sort of draconian calculation like that.
Sure.
But that's the fear. And all I can say is there's no amount of adverbs you can use. There's no way of couching this message that is going to completely avoid opposition and confrontation. And we got to really decide. We've got to really count the cost. Whether you look at U.S. history or the Bible, people who stood up for truth had a tough road in this life. Are you willing to walk that road if it means following Jesus? And that's all I can say.
I love when you start working in Bible texts. That's I've heard you preach too, and I also don't love it when you just throw in casually white Christian nationalism. I'm out of time to follow up on some of those questions, but that's okay. That's okay, because this is probably the longest podcast we've done, but I think it was important to kind of walk through some of these conversations. I really do want to encourage those of you listening to engage Jemar's work. I don't know that you're going to agree with, I think, the history stuff. I mean, he's right. Some of you immediately think, well, the 1619 Project was, there have been challenges to some of that, though I want to encourage you to look at that. That's how we learn, is by looking at things. I'm a professor. Let's read original sources. Yeah. So read The Color of Compromise. And also, too, his book on just where people have been engaging, the book on racism as well. And that's often been used in churches, things of that sort. It's called How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity, and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. I will say, I don't usually close with my own thought, but I will in this context, that I do stand in that corner where Billy Graham is pictured right next to Martin Luther King Jr. and had a complex relationship, and the letters are very, and Jemar cites some of them in the book. I would also say that one of the reasons that I care about, I'm engaged in these issues, is because of the words of Billy Graham later in his life, who said he should have been more involved and shouldn't be engaged, and he regretted it. And the reality is, it's not always easy. Doesn't mean you're going to get painted with people. You're going to be, well, he says this or he read this, and that's okay. At the end of the day, through the lens of Scripture, we tell the good news of the gospel, and the implications of the gospel include dealing with these realities.
You've been listening to Dr. Jemar Tisby. You can learn more about him at JemarTisby.com. And don't forget to check out his books, The Color of Compromise and How to Fight Racism. You can find more interviews with the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast, as well as other great content from ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com. And don't forget that you can check out our extended portions of some of our interviews at ChurchLeaders.com/plus. And again, if you found our conversation helpful today, we'd love for you to take a few moments, leave us a review. That'll help other ministry leaders find us and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast. For more great interviews, as well as articles, videos, and free resources, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.